so much, everyone, for having joined our webinar. My name is Samuele Tonello, and I'm a senior research coordinator at EuroHealthNet. EuroHealthNet is a European partnership of public health bodies, and we work on the social determinants of health and health inequalities. And today I'm here also as part of FEAST. FEAST is an Horizon-funded project that focuses on a transition to healthier and more sustainable food systems. In FEAST, we at EuroHealthNet, together with the Roskilde University, we are leading the policy activities. And in this work package, we also have what we call the policy chats. So in the policy chats, usually I select a topic and then we discuss internally and we try to see how to maximize the impact of our research and of our project. When this when these topics are quite important, we decide that we want to have a public webinar and we want to discuss with the whole community. And this is why we are here today. And so we are here today because, as you've all seen, and I know everyone is familiar with this, we had the European elections, our European institution change, and with this change also came a change in the direction. There are new topics, new discussions, and especially new directions towards which we are going. And this direction, especially, there is this magic word that has appeared over the last few months, that is competitiveness. And here especially so, and I literally quote the president of the commission who said that the competitiveness compass will be the North Star of the new commission. So this is really interesting to see for us that we are working in this field. It's also like why this word came and this concept became so widespread. And it was interesting to see also how quick it spread to all the parts. We are talking now about putting the research funds into this framework. We are having all the departments of the commission in the parliament. So there is all over the place this aspect on we should focus on how to best be able to compete, especially against the US and China. And this is already interesting as a concept. But then what is interesting, it's also why this concept and how did this concept get to become our North Star. And so here, of course, we don't have too much time, and I will trivialize a little bit the process, but if we look at it, it's basically a guy that decided that he wanted to share and write a report on what the ideal society should look like, and especially for our continent, for the European continent. And so he wrote a report, and so after he wrote this report, and even before and during the report, he then consulted with some of his friends and people that think very similar to his view, and they all together decided that yes, this is the way to move forward, and this is how the competitiveness framework became a little bit so widespread. And I think that it's actually very interesting because it's any normative debate, and when I say normative, it's really how our society should look like. It's really, really important because it's not a discussion that a few philosophers have on the side that has no reflection in reality. But if we look at power, it's actually really important because who gets to decide which is the direction towards which we want to go, then has a significant political power in all society, because all the decisions that we take afterwards are meant to go towards that direction. And for us working in the civil society organization, NGOs, or environmental organization, public health bodies, it was also a part of that. This report, we were not actually part of it, so we were excluded. And so for us, it was also a little bit on, we would like, especially in a democratic setting, to have a say in where we want to go and if this is the right direction. Is it really where we want to go? Do we really want to compete against this as our main goal for our societies and for our institutions? And so, of course, here today, it's why we want to be here is that we were not part of this process. We want to have a say, and it's also we want to be able to question this North Star that was put there. Is it really where we want to go, or should we go somewhere else? And so, of course, we are a bit delusional, but not as much as we think that we will rebalance all the discussion at European level. But I want really to have this webinar today to discuss alternatives. So if not, it's like we want to put into question this North Star. Is it the competitiveness really where we want to go? And we want to propose an alternative. So I think that too often civil society organizations and NGOs, they've been really good at criticizing or really saying this is not what we should do. But we really lacked, especially over the last few decades, being able to propose an alternative. So this is actually where we want to go. This is actually our other star that we want to chase, and this is what we want to do today. And so I feel really privileged and lucky that we managed to invite 3 super interesting speakers, from Tim to Molly and Anand, that will then be introduced. And with them, it will not just be a response to the Dragi report. It will not just be stressing what the problem is, but I really ask them, and I would really want them to stress which are the alternatives. So how could not only our society, but especially for our case, our food systems, because it's like in FEAST we are really focused on food policies, and here in this debate it's really when food policies really merge on the overall structure of our societies. And so we really want to hear from them. It's like what alternatives are there and which is the where we want to go, basically. And so we will have this webinar today, and it will be moderated by my colleague Sofia Romagosa, who is a research officer at EuroHealthNet and is also part of the FEAST of the EuroHealthNet team in FEAST. And so she will take good care of you with this moderation. She will explain now how the webinar will be structured. And yes, I really look forward to the discussion, and I hope you participate as much as possible in the question and answers. And I will now move to Sofia, that I can see on the screen. So up to you, Sofia.
Thank you, Samuele, and thanks also for providing such a nice introduction and why we're here and why this policy chat is relevant. Before I start introducing the speakers, yes, I would like to just briefly explain how this webinar will be happening. So basically we will be having 3 different presentations, and after each presentation we will have around 10-minute Q&A session. So if you have any question to the speakers, please feel free to use the chat, and I'll be monitoring the chat and all the questions while the presenters are speaking, and then we will take the questions after the presentations. We will do our best to address as many questions as possible, and if we do not manage and we still have remaining time at the end of the webinar, then we will try to address a few more questions. So with further ado, I would like to start introducing the first speaker of the day, who is Professor Timothy Lang. He is a well-known academic and expert in food policy, known for his contributions linked to sustainable food systems, food security, food democracy, and he became in 2021 an emeritus professor of food policy at City University London Centre for Food Policy, and has been a professor on food policy at the university for around 20 years. He has also been a consultant for WHO, FAO, UNEP, and in different time points in his career as well. He has also been a special advisor to 4 House of Commons Select Committee inquiries in the UK on topics like food standards, food security, food sustainability, also a commissioner on the UK's Governance Sustainable Development Commission, a member of the Council of Food Policy Advisors to the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and is also since 2009 a member of the Mayor of London's Food Board, among many other outstanding contributions through his career. And his presentation today will be setting the scene into this policy chat, driving us through different current issues that have been contributed to a food system that now is in shock mode and that are currently blocking the development of food systems towards a healthier and more sustainable direction. So thank you, Professor Lang, for being here, for accepting our invitation, and I would like to pass the word to you.
Okay, there we are. Thank you, Sophia. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, Samuela. Thank you to the FEAST as well as EuroHealthNet. I'm going to dive straight in. I have spent the last 2 years, more than 2 years, working as hard as I've ever worked in my life, in 50 years of work on this. I was asked by an organization in my country, Brexit Land, to say how resilient is the UK. And that has made me think very, very deeply about where is European food systems going? Where is my country going? Is that period of 70 years of trying to have cooperation across borders, is it being questioned? Is competitiveness, the Dragi report, cutting across that? And what are the arguments that we can use? And my focus has been in my report, in what I'm going to talk with you about, is going to be on the public, not the food system, but the public of Europe, the public of Britain. And now I go to my first slide. These slides are few. Some of them are quite dense. I shall go through them fast. But this first one, I will tell you what I'm doing. I'm drawing on this report that I've done, which is not yet out. It's going to be out next month. I've been looking at shocks. What potential shocks to the European food system, which provides 30% of British food and is the exchange across the European Union. Are we prepared? Is the public prepared for shocks? Are Europeans, they think food just comes from the supermarket. Does this matter? Is competitiveness something that will affect the consumer? There is a scale and potential of those shocks, which basically reorganizes the individuality of consumer choice. And it, I think, returns us to older collective notions of security. I want to see defense come back into security. We use this term food security as though somehow it's all about society. It is, but it is also not. It requires an infrastructure which can be destroyed. Why do I say that? Just think Ukraine. Just think Gaza. Whatever your politics, just think Sudan. We have big examples of how food can be weaponized, to use that terrible American phrase. And I want to explore particularly the difference between food security and food resilience. Food resilience is about the public bouncing back. Is it the system bouncing back or the public bouncing back? And I want to actually give that attention onto the public. I think this is a very dangerous time. We know that, but it also has some opportunities. Some of the arguments that social and civil society has been trying to get into the European food system, actually now they become more important, not less important, more important. And what will the new order emerge? And I'm sort of opening that up for my colleagues. Okay, now I go faster. In one slide, this is my conclusion. If we think about the Common Agricultural Policy, the Stresa policy, the foundation of the six, the European six, in 1957, then 58, it was about rebuilding iron and steel, coal, nuclear and food. But food was defined as agriculture. We've had this problem of the Common Agricultural Policy, which has not really been a food policy. It assumed that as long as we produce enough food, the people will be fed. We no longer can assume that. I will explore a bit. And my answer, a key insight from my report, forthcoming report, is that when we think now about modern food systems, we don't really know what they're for. And this is my answer to what they're now for. I think the goal is in the middle, the green, it's feeding all people well. And we can define what we mean by well. And around that central goal becomes six key features. We need food security in the way that we mean it, and Molly Anderson will talk about later. We need food sustainability in the sense of planetary limits, redesigning the environmental impacts. We need food democracy. Consumerism is not food democracy. Late capitalism said democracy is just what you choose at the checkout. It's democracy at the checkout. Food democracy is a deeper and more engaged notion of citizenship. I think we need to rethink and re-engage with food defense. Infrastructure of food requires defense. It's about military defense, but also us protecting ourselves. I'm very interested in the Swedish notion of total defense, and I have argued, and will argue in my report when it comes out, you'll see it, that we need to actually in Europe talk of total food defense. What do we mean by that? That's not saying go away foreigners. It's saying we need to have the capacity to ensure all the people are fed well. That's central goal. And that needs preparing for shocks. Why? Because the shocks are coming. They're with us. Climate change, all sorts of things are going on. And that requires us to have a more social look at food risks. And around that central set of 6, around the central goal, are all these other features. You can look at this later if you want. But that is essentially my message in one slide. Trying to move, there it is. You know this, the clock is ticking. The evidence is that the food system is heading for trouble. We know it's in a mess. We know it's facing what we now call the polycrisis, a mixture of social inequalities, distorted economics, consumerist lock-ins, geopolitics, one moment drought, the next moment floods, war, the Internet of Things. 30,000 Houthis have added 15% to shipping costs of bringing in food from outside Europe into Europe. This is a new world compared to the post-Second World War reconstruction. The next slide. At the heart of it is the shift of efficiency that in this slide around in yellow there, associated with just-in-time logistics. That graphic illustrates really the fantasy of modern European food politics, that we will have a seamless integrated system from farm to factory, to processor, to distributor, to retailer, to the consumer. And it's underpinned by this infrastructure of moving stuff. And in the modern world, top right, that's the Internet of Things at sea. But that same internet is actually the basis of modern warfare. Most logistics is actually run through the internet through cables, but positioning is determined by those satellites. These are very vulnerable. As we see in Ukraine, they are now the source of war and the location of war. And in these two slides put together on the left-hand side and the right, we see the importance of this new, actually old concept of choke points. The world's food travels through certain pinch points or choke points. In shipping, and on the left, there are the 15 or 17 top ones. On the right, that they're produced according to maize, wheat, rice, and soybean, the main internationally traded commodities. Europe thinks it produces its own food. It draws huge amounts of soybeans and so on. The movement of food has continued in a dramatic way. But at the same time, compared to 80 years ago, the beginning of the Common Agricultural Policy, 70 years ago, when the problem was underproduction, we now actually have a problem of overproduction. There is too much food. It is so cheap that in the processed mass commodities that when they are produced, they are turned into what now increasingly we call ultra-processed foods, which is giving us the ill health, is causing people to become fat, landing on problems of health care, health insurance and health services, which is causing great damage to the economies. It's distorting the food economy. We have too much food, too wrong food, inappropriate diets. We've changed, we eat all the time, and so on. We eat feast day foods every day, but they look like feast day foods, but they're actually made from mass commodities. And within that is enormous growth of corporate power. In Europe, 3% of 3,000 companies produce 50% of the processed food. That's 1% of companies, of the 3 million companies. What is going on? We have very little democratic control over this. And the net picture is one of gaps widening. I keep on in my research report and other writings and reading other people voluminously. We are all conscious of the gap between the evidence of what needs to happen and what is happening. We have health gaps, consumption gaps, evidence policy gaps, the environmental gap, values gaps, decision gaps. As I said, consumers are supposed to be in control of markets, but they're not in control of markets. They have some element of choice, some element of control, but actually they have very little power compared to the corporate power. So we have a problem of gaps. what's the vision for this? We are debating the legacy of Mr. Draghi and his competitiveness push, or what is that? What does Europe really have a clear view? He might say competitiveness, but that is not necessarily the same thing as what goes on. And I think there is a fundamental problem about democracy, it being in crisis. But the norm, as Samuela said in his very nice introduction, is, I've put here my second bullet point, that the norm is actually muddle, that English word, not straight lines, but things going zigzag, going back on themselves, looking like spaghetti maps. Meanwhile, the food stresses and threats are growing. This is not a good policy situation. And I've been looking at where are the potential shocks which will actually determine how this food system operates, either in crisis or without crisis. And they're things like this. I won't read them through. Some of these, you will probably know all of these, but we have serious opportunities for big difficulties, serious disruption. And I have been interviewing senior people in the food industries, in civil society, in politics, and academia and science, and looking at very ordinary people, us, the public, asking people in small businesses, asking people in cities, in towns, in villages, in rural areas, in town areas, what do they think? What is going on? And generally there is a feeling that there is no one in control. There is no one in control. There's no clear vision yet. But meanwhile, we can be increasingly clear about the food threats and risks. And in this, I've just listed 9 classifications that my report has come up, 7 that have come up, but others have come up with different ones. And it's all the time being shaped by the reality. That top right photo is what Russia did to Mariupol, the major grain export port of Ukraine, within the first months. It completely blitzkrieged it. We have to use the German word, the Second World War. It's obliterated it. And the bottom right is what happens when things go wrong. These are Gazans rioting against food aid for Gazans. And there are criminal gangs, out of control, thugs controlling badly sourced foods within Gaza. This is how social order can get very complicated and very different. Very quickly, I just want to stress upon you, this sort of analysis is not just people like us or academics like me. I have been surprised by within business in some of my interviews. Some of them see the world exactly the same as this. They see big trouble. They see the model of the last 70 years creaking and being in real difficulties. This is from the big insurance network called Lloyd's, based in London, one of the underpinnings of capitalism that ensures how shipping works, the risk and the reinsurance industry. They came up with an analysis a year and a half ago, very similar to what I'm talking about. Here is another from Aon, a big industry consulting group. Again, you can look at these later. And the World Economic Forum on the right, picking up on that Chatham House study done by Laura Wellesley and Rob Bailey 7 years ago into choke points, and governments beginning to use the choke points database to analyze where the risks are occurring. They see the danger of risks as growing, not dropping. And this is from the big food industry think tank in Britain, the IGD. They came up with a list a year ago, 10 months ago, of 10 major threats about to shape the British food system. None of this will be of a surprise at all, but my point is we are not on our own now. We are actually thinking some of our very sober analysis about health and environmental externalities, social disruption, is now shared from very different starting points by others. Now, what does this mean in terms of thinking about security, the goal that has got me out of bed for 50 years, and some of you, Molly Anderson, I know well, for decades too? Well, on the left is the CFS, Committee of Food Security, expert panels, latest iteration of those 6 interconnected features: affordability, availability, stability, sustainability, utilization, etc. It's all a lovely circle of idealized characteristics that we want. On the right is a model from Chris Benney, a development economist. Some of you may know, I know him, from, I think, a very neat study he did a couple of years ago, reminding us that resilience is actually linear. It's not circular, it's linear. Resilience is about an event in time. The normality is cut across, and then there are shocks from it, reactions from it, anticipations from it can determine how those shocks after it are interpreted. But it's a linear process. There is a difference in these models. But the key point about resilience is trying to be more prepared for those shocks rather than less prepared. And that becomes very interesting politically. But what does this term resilience really mean? In my report, there's a whole chapter on unpicking these meanings. Look, resilience comes from the Latin, resilio, to bounce back from a shock. But it's actually been picked up by many disciplines. There is a very big and good literature with all these disciplines claiming they determine and they understand resilience. Actually, they interpret it differently. I have a grandson who is an architect. They are taught resilience is the building will shake with an earthquake or with a flood, but will stay in the same place. It doesn't go away. Ecologists mean by resilience something totally different. It may go to a totally new state of affairs at a different level, that top example. But the bottom is, I think, a very neat graphic representation. Resilience is about bouncing within certain limits, but maybe it will bounce to another level. But that's very different if you're a psychologist. I originally studied as a psychologist, and I was very interested in the resilience studies from the Second World War of children who were traumatized, concentration camps, bombing, losing their parents, etc., shocks. And that whole literature, indeed the whole 70, 80 years of experience, has been about trying to build back people as they become something different. They go to a new place, they grow. These are very different notions of resilience. But if we're talking about a food system, it's not just one of these. It's all of these different things. Food is both physics, it's biology, it's sociology, how we relate, it's culture, it's the psychology, it's ideas, it's our minds, it's all of that. So this makes food security for Europe look very complicated. So Mr. Draghi's competitiveness is frankly stupid because it's too narrow. That is the point number one I'm making. It doesn't deal with the complexity of food. Now we can go back. Others have been in this analysis before. When, in the 1960s, the RAND Corporation, a breakaway from or an offshoot of the American military, now just a very powerful consultancy business, basically, they were asked to look at the telecommunications of the US. How could it be destroyed? Very easily was the analysis of this study, because there is a single hub, if you like, in this model here in the middle, servicing telecommunications to 20 spokes. If we made it more decentralized, they said, that's the middle model, it's more robust, it's got greater capacity to be resilient. But even better would be to go to the right-hand side of this, which is what Paul Baran, the author of this famous study for the RAND Corporation in 62, 64, called distributed. Now, of course, that was the idea of the web. In blue here, I've put that. The idea of the World Wide Web was to decentralize, to have it networking people, but in a way that no one controls. The reality is it is controlled by very few gatekeepers. So we are actually in a very interesting place. But there are some core themes that I think are useful now to nail down, and I've tried to do this in my forthcoming report, what do we mean by resilience? I'm not going to read these out, but there are some disciplinary perspectives that can be brought together, and they're brought together, I think, on the right. The common features of what we're talking about for food are that we need to think about infrastructure, resources, the impacts of shocks, the dynamics, social, physical, etc., the outcomes over time, short-term, long-term, and the feedback loops. What are the impacts on a child as he or she is developing from that early trauma? Well, we are not thinking enough about that sort of analysis for food, and I think we can and should. Here's the RAND Corporation again. I'm doing my study, and lo, I find the RAND Corporation, 60 years on, comes back and is doing work for the military. Of course, it always does a lot of work for the military, but also not. These are very sharp people in my experience. And this is a study they did for bits of NATO, including my own government. It's published. And they said, look, if we're thinking about resilience, we need more attention on society. They say, I absolutely agree. This is how I came across it. They said, look, we can reduce it to 3 very simple messages. The people must be better prepared so that they can respond and be better at recovery. This is from a military-oriented organization. Well, this is interesting, very interesting. You can look at this later. Meanwhile, the psychologists are getting into more and more depth about the psyche, not about society, as though they're separate. Interesting literature reviews. I'm putting these if anyone wants to follow them up. A very interesting review in the International Journal of Disaster and Risk Reduction, done by an international team, Sarah Teo and other colleagues a few years ago. And they identified a large number of characteristics for resilient society as opposed to unresilient societies. I won't explain this, but I have found nothing that answered some of my problems, so I've tried to come up with my own answers. What do we mean by civil food vulnerability? What are the manifestations in society if devastation occurs to the food system of a region or a society? Big scale. I'm looking at big scale, not just my house being blown up, but a whole city going down, or the internet destroying everyone's sources of information. What are those dynamics? That's what's interested me. The truth is, what comes out is the limits of individualism. The limits of individualism. I think I've got 4 minutes left. I have looked in my report, 10 country studies. I won't talk about the others. This is from my own country, which suddenly out of nowhere said to the British public, well, shocks are coming. We want you to store 3 days of food, please. This was ignoring all the evidence from within British society that 1/5 of British society is so financially squeezed that the parents are eating badly in order to allow their children to eat something. This is a very unequal society, just being told all store food. Well, this is a very thin approach. And don't get confident. You say, my country is different. You look at what we've found. But we've also, in this study, the study that I've done, looked at what practically can citizens do. They can grow food, they can do all sorts of things, but not enough attention has been done into the community and the social networks for food. Can rock festival catering systems become something that's useful if entire cities get attacked? How is it, you need to ask, how do Gazans feed themselves when food is so short? They have collective kitchens. In rich European societies, we don't have collective kitchens. Oh, yes, we do. They're used very often for other purposes. We're not thinking enough about them. I'm not going to go into that too much. For me, and old people, the modern world of food systems really begins with the Hot Springs Conference. If you don't know that, it's time you did. You need to go and look it up. This basically was the architecture being created for post-Second World War reconstruction. And it had very simple 4 goals. You can read those. If we go to Sweden now, Sweden, a very interesting country always, a small country, but acutely aware that it too could be invaded. It has a powerful military, but it's not particularly, it knows only too well Russia could cause great harm. Last year, out came a report, which I think is the most important report since Hot Springs, and really Europe ought to be doing this for itself, a new approach to food preparedness. Its title in English is Food Preparedness for a New Era. And basically it is arguing that Sweden has to take more attention to defense, more attention to rebuilding storage, not getting rid of it, which is what we have done over the last 40 years particularly. It's been seen as inefficient, a break on competitiveness, and now Mr. Draghi wants more competitiveness. Sweden is saying, actually, we need more redundancy. We need more following of the Stockholm Resilience Centre's advice. I'm not going to read that. All of this, to begin to finish, really points to the need for a rethink about the connection between civil society and the food system. Some of this we academics have been talking about for decades. Can consumers become citizens? Actually, the key thing is we need more attention to networks, to horizontal connections. And in some of my case studies I've looked at, I've been very impressed by some societies beginning to experiment, not often in the name of resilience, but they're actually building resilience. I've been very impressed by the Wallonia, in part of Belgium, the Food Belt movement, which has really been a social movement. They started rebuilding some horticulture around their cities, not feeding the cities, but feeding more of their cities. But really, they're building social and community at a regional level, at a bigger subnational scale. What this requires, I'll just merely say, the social infrastructure to be taken more seriously. Graphically, this is what I'm arguing for, that we need to be arguing that the future for European food system, for the rich world, is to stop being complacent and to actually listen to more of what's emerged in the developing world. How do Gazans feed themselves? They do it by cooperation, but even that is breaking down in war circumstances. And we need to look at the social infrastructure that underpins food, citizens in community. And we haven't been doing that institutionally enough. I won't go into this, but I've done many organograms of how Britain and other societies work. And my point is, if we apply a multi-level analysis from the global and the central economies to the very local, what we've now got to be preparing for is not single crises, but multiple crises. And that's why we need to be better organized. Remember, I'm a policy man, so I'm asked to come up with policy solutions that people could run with. And one of my big thoughts is we need to have everywhere across Europe civil society committees which are organized and prepared and preparing the public for shocks and being that civil voice and engagement point. And this slide basically shows that and the sort of people I think should be involved. But to end, Samuela and Sophia, it comes back to my second slide. The future for Europe is not competitiveness. Competitiveness has its place in market economies, that's fair enough, but not if it's the only goal. The food and health movement and the food and health scientists and professions must really stand up for something better. And I think something better is the kind of vision and argument that I've been trying to explore very fast with you. The goal of feeding all the people well requires more attention to infrastructure, so food defense, food sustainability. A more resilient food system is one that was already trying to minimize the damage from climate change and to build more diversity and less concentrated food systems. So thank you very much. I've given you an awful lot, but thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Professor Lang. Very inspirational presentation. We received 2 different questions from in the chat. There seems to be quite an interest in the concept of weaponization. And there is one particular question in relation, well, if you could elaborate a little bit more on this concept, on the weaponization of food in the context of sustainable and healthy food systems and plant-based diets, in comparison to the level of weaponization in the context of the current food systems where there is more, where like animal-based foods are more predominant, right? And
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. It's a good question. It's one I get asked a lot. Look, behind me, you probably can't see, I have lots of books, decades of reading. Food has always been weaponized. Food has been used as a weapon. Countries have invaded other countries, destroyed their food systems. Cities have been blockaded by cut off from food and water. There's nothing new about the weaponization of food. It may be a new word, it's an ugly word, but it's an ugly reality. Why I raise it is because we see it. It is now part of. As a former psychologist, let me tell you, food is used as a weapon by children on their parents, by parents on their children. We use food as a mechanism of control, but also food as a mechanism of self-pleasure and social pleasure. So we should not be surprised by the return of a phrase like food weaponization. But we need to be clear about the different meanings and the different operational features of it. So that's point number one. Point number two is what we learned, the people, when I was a young man starting off in food 50 years ago, after my PhD, and I changed direction, I met old people who'd gone through from the 1930s, and they used to say, you young people think you're being radical. You're not thinking radically enough. And now I know what they mean. We have been stuck in our disciplines. We've been stuck in our comfortable Europeanness. We've been stuck in a patronization of the developing world. And we can learn an awful lot, Sophia, from looking at how does a rich city like London, I live in the middle of London, the biggest city in Europe, when I sit on the London Food Board, you announced me as that, advising the mayors, they're my only one major role. And when 5 years ago we set out to try to map the food system of London, we couldn't do it. Not even the big retailers, the producers, the farmers knew. It's so complicated, no one really has a grip on it. And yet there are these power brokers who say that they know, but they don't really know. And when COVID happened, they did know, but they didn't know. So weaponization takes us into very interesting places, Sophia.
Thank you. Then there is another question. Let's see if you manage to say something about it in just 1 or 2 minutes. How do we confront corporate concentration and power? If it's by pursuing a civil food resilience, or is it by dismantling it?
Well, that's a very old question. And it's one which is obviously totally political. You know, if you're a particular political persuasion, you'll have different answers. As an academic, I will say you need all of the interventions. One of the things we learned over the last 40 years of trying to understand the complexity of the freeing up of regional and national and international food systems so that they blend and they merge and they interpenetrate each other and they colonialize without even owning entities or owning land. One of the things we understand is that new forms of corporate power exist. One of the things that I've got from studying the logistics industry, which is actually the most important infrastructure. of food. We talk about the big power of manufacturers or retailers. They move almost nothing. It's the logistics industry that moves things on wagons, on planes, boats. It's mostly boats and lorries. And the thing I learned from them is that they are actually mostly small businesses, but they work for very big businesses. So they are, if you like, small entrepreneurs who are working for very big entrepreneurs. And one of the things we learned, and some studies are now coming out about the lessons from COVID, is that corporate power itself wasn't quite clear what it had control over. I don't know about your country, but in my country, emergency powers were used. Competition law was suspended in COVID in Britain by a right-wing Conservative government. They suspended it. Now, will climate change lead to the suspension of competition policy? I don't know. So to answer it in one sentence, Sophia, I think no one intervention can alter corporate power. But what you get from looking at corporate power by looking at through the lens that I've been offering you of food defense and food resilience for shocks is that you start saying we need to have more diverse food economy. It's not good enough having 1% of food manufacturing in Europe providing 50% of the food for Europe. It's too dangerous.
Thank you for the answer. I hope that it has answered also the question from the person in the audience. Just for a matter of time, I'm afraid that we are not able to answer more questions. Hopefully, we managed to answer more questions throughout the webinar or at the very end. And I'm sure that the two next speakers will touch base most likely on some of the questions in the chat. So thank you, Professor Lang, for your presentation, for answering the questions. It has been lovely having you here.